As I mentioned earlier, it's a very Canadian broadcast today. Not all Canadian, but a lot of Canadians. Mr. Martin Popoff is Canadian. The band Rush we're talking about is Canadian. And of course, the man we're going to bring in, who now a little bit of a different role this time. You know him. He's been on the show many, many times talking about the production, but we're going to switch it up and have him talk about the album itself and not the production this time. Yet another Canadian, Mr. Jay Ruston. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Brian. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. It's kind of criminal a bit that we haven't talked about Rush yet on this podcast. My apologies, but there are so many great bands, and clearly, Rush is one of the greatest metal bands of all time, and very significant. In trying to figure out what song to pick, it's really difficult because you could pick 15 different Rush songs that were part of 100 songs that define heavy metal. But this one actually was brought up by Martin Popoff, who was like this. He felt, and you heard Martin earlier, he was really feeling that this was really the first real progressive metal song. Now, I'm not sure I would 100% agree with that, but it certainly is in the early era of that. And, Rush, probably the biggest purveyors of that. And this song did have a lot of different things going on. So when you first heard this song, Jay, what was your opinion?
Well, I didn't hear this song until the 80s and probably mid 80s. It probably had been out for 12 or 14 years before I even was aware of it. Growing up near Detroit in Windsor, Canada, I probably heard Tom Sawyer and Limelight first because they got played on the radio every single day in Detroit and probably still do. And I was visiting my sister in college. She was a few years older than me, and one of her roommates had 2112 on vinyl. And I was a casual Rush fan at that point. I had barely picked up the bass guitar at that point. And he played me this record, and it blew my mind. And I just went down this crazy Rush rabbit hole. And when I heard Anthem, to me, this was a metal song for sure, compared to everything else I was listening to at the time. A little bit of Sabbath, some Van Halen, lots of Iron Maiden. Hadn't even discovered Metallica yet. I was a late Metallica person. Um, and as a bass player, for me, this song was everything because it was really difficult to play. The timing was strange. The song was strange, and progressive is a great word for it. I don't think it's the first progressive metal song. Geddy Lee himself will tell you that Yes is the first progressive rock band, probably. And, his huge influence was Chris Squire, who had the killer bass tone. He was using Marshall amps like Lemmy and many other bass players that wanted, distortion and grind on their bass. And there's a few Yes songs years before this that are pretty heavy and pretty progressive and all over the place, especially as a bass player. So to me, this is Yes. That's what this is. And maybe a little Zeppelin too. But it's clearly them finding their way as a band. Their drummer's been in the band for less than a year. It's just an incredible recording, an incredible song. The whole album's great. Terry Brown, first album in the producer's chair, of course. And I know we're not specifically talking about production, but it sounds great. Toronto Sound Studios, which I believe was a Trident A range console, which are just the greatest sounding boards. So yeah, was my first initial impressions of this song. Killer bass line. It's a metal song, or at least heavy rock.
Yeah, I came in on Rush on 2112 and then went backwards. So I went, 2112 and then Caress of Steel, which I absolutely love Caress of Steel, and then
Hmm.
back to this one. So, Caress of Steel to me, even though it was not one of their larger albums, obviously, success wise in terms of sales, I love that record. And that record, there's so much heavy stuff on there. And
Hmm.
certainly this is a very heavy song and definitely the very early stages of what Rush would become in terms of the progressive stuff. I think they really fleshed it out on Caress of Steel, but this song in particular is definitely a lot going on. And again, Neil Peart's first album he played drums on was a real part of, obviously. And you could see his influence. I mean, if you listen to the first Rush album and you go into this one, it's a clearly different animal musically. Like they'd gotten better as musicians, and then you put him in this drummer doing all these amazing drum tones. Like I think that uplifted everybody's playing, both Geddy's playing and Alex's playing as well. And you have this really interesting song that they start constructing, and it was kind of the beginnings of this is what Rush was going to become, and this was certainly a very classic, absolutely classic record. So Rush, this was the beginning. This was definitely the beginning, as Martin had said. So, and Martin picked this song, so I have to blame him for all of that. But again, it's so hard to pick these songs because there's so many great Rush songs. But I do like going back to the early stages of it because it clearly, like I said earlier, you can definitely see this was the beginning of what Rush was going to become, and this is a pretty complicated song for early '70s rock metal, whatever you want to call it.
When I did a covers record with Anthrax, we did this song, and when he first, I think it was Charlie or Frank, one of them mentioned we were going to do it, and I said, "Are you sure?" Because to me, it's like covering. There's a few bands that are very difficult, if not impossible, to cover. Rush, Queen, even Led Zeppelin to an extent. There's a few, and not because the bands aren't great players or anything. It's just it's hard to mess with perfection.
Yeah, right.
And a lot of bands, I like when bands cover Metallica. I like, not that they aren't also perfect in their own way, but I like when people take an alternative approach to a Metallica song or a Megadeth song or anything like that. But I find Rush very challenging because most people just miss the spirit of it. And knowing how much Charlie and Frank especially love Rush, and Scott too, and Joey, they all love Rush. So I knew they were going to do it justice, and they did. They played it great. They nailed it. It's a very derivative cover, purposely. And so getting to record the song gave me a whole other appreciation for how difficult it was. And, clearly there's no click track, there's no metronome. It's just a killer band playing. And as you said, the first album's a very different animal with John Rutsey playing drums. He was very much a Bad Company kind of bluesy drummer, and that was his deal. And that's the kind of band they were at that point. There's some interesting stuff on the first album, and I do like it. Finding My Way, it's just killer. And Terry Brown recorded and mixed that record. He just wasn't producing it. But,
Yeah,
by the time they get here and they've been on the road with Neil Peart for 6 months, clearly they're jamming at sound check and, opening for Uriah Heep, who's also was pretty progressive at the time. So, who I also got to work with and had lots of great chats with Mick about Rush. So it within 6 months, this band completely reformed in a way.
yeah, and it was like I said earlier. I think just Neil coming in and really being this incredible player certainly brought up everybody's.
Kicking
Uh,
them in the ass.
yeah, 100%. It's like, oh, we got to keep up with this guy now.
Yes,
We were lucky enough to use Terry Brown quite a bit. He produced Fates Warning and some stuff
that's
for
right.
us. So, and when they were doing Parallels in Toronto at the studio that Geddy Lee was part of one of the owners, I got to spend a lot of time up there. And really, Terry's a great guy. Just to, he
Mhm.
didn't mind us grilling him about Rush
No,
every
not
so
at all. He's
often.
cool
So,
with that.
yeah,
When
which
I
is
was
great.
in When I was in college, with Jack Richardson, he brought in Terry Brown to do a lecture.
Oh wow.
And he came in and there was about maybe 25 of us. And he came in and he was just talking about recording and all the different things. And the room just got really quiet at some point. And he literally said, "You guys can ask me about Rush." And then like 25 hands went up. And I was like, everybody starts asking him. And one of my really good friends who I still talk to this day from college said, "Why did you go to Wales to record at Rockfield for some of the later records, in the mid 70s?" And he said the band just wanted to get away from, home and be isolated because it was so challenging and difficult to record some of those records and some of those songs. I mean, La Villa Strangiato, I think they spent 3 weeks on that song or something ridiculous
I could
because
imagine.
they tried to play it as one take, and in the end they gave up and did it in 3 sections, I think, and cut it together. But it was just really interesting because when you think of Rockfield, you think of Queen, even Oasis, and many other classic records. You don't think about Rush, but they were a huge part of Rockfield's history.
Yeah, and 100%. It's really interesting when you look at bands who, more or less create a genre, and we can go back to, like you mentioned, yes, and that they to me were the first progressive rock band. They were really doing something really interesting in the early '70s that clearly had a huge influence on Rush, as did the blues and all the other things that we know of that have become heavy metal. But when you're kind of creating your own genre, that's what really fascinates me. And I love, I've talked about this a lot on this podcast where I love things that are different and bands that are different. And that's, even seeping all the way into the record label, I don't want to sign 100 bands that sound like, Black Dahlia Murder. I want to sign a bunch of bands that sound different and they're doing different things. And that's what always excites you when you hear something. It's like, oh, that's a different take on things. So yeah, that's always been super exciting to me. And that was the thing with Rush too, is 2112 when it came out. That's obviously a song that I'm sure we will get to at some point. Although we're
Hmm.
running out of episodes here, where I think we only have like 38 or so left, which is somewhat frightening, but good at the same time. But when you hear something like that, it's just so different, especially when it came out. And the fact that when I was on the radio back then, which is kind of crazy because it was so long and so many things going on. But then you go, like I said, you start going backtracking and tracing things. And here we go with Anthem, where like it's always been a really interesting song to me, because when I think about it, I don't look at it as like being super heavy or super progressive. To me, it seems like just a very good hard rock heavy metal song. But when you sit down and start breaking it down, it's like, oh yeah, there's all these crazy drum parts and there's these other parts that are really different, and you can kind of see the formation of how their brains started thinking when they were writing these songs.
Oh yeah. One thing I always found interesting too about this song, just to be a bit nerdy, is it's pretty much like a mono guitar track. There is some overdubbing and doubling, but and a lot of the first two records, plenty of stereo guitar, everything doubled. But for some reason, this song, when it first comes in, you're like, oh wow, this is essentially a mono mix. You got one guitar, one bass, drum kit, vocals, and a lot of bands are really afraid to take that risk. Of course, Van Halen did it, but Don Landee would pan the guitar to one side so you'd get some sort of idea of stereo. But like fast forward 35 years to Tool, another progressive metal band, I would say 3 albums in a row, the guitar is in mono, right up the center. Even some of their biggest hits are in mono, which is really interesting that they're still able to retain all that power and force without this massive left and right guitar stack. And that goes a long way in a record that came out in 1974 that's essentially a big mono guitar, and it still sounds fat and huge and punchy. And I would absolutely, it felt metal to me as a teenager, and it's heavy. So to me, this is a metal song.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe it's just my brain being strange, but I listen to it and look, it starts out da 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 da. I mean, that's super progressive for
It is.
when it came out. But it always felt to me this song was very melodic, just very melodic. It doesn't seem overly heavy to me. It doesn't seem overly for progressive, but yet when you break it down, it is. So it's interesting how they wrote that, and clearly, I think this sets up way later when Rush starts writing the big hits, where they write these really interesting songs. Red Barchetta is a good example. I mean, there's so many of these track Tom Sawyer, where it's a very commercial friendly track, but they've got these parts in it that are just holy cow, that's crazy, hard to play and very progressive. But
Hmm.
it seems it's just a good song. It's interesting how sometimes your brain functions when you listen to these things.
I think Geddy doesn't get any credit for his killer vocal melodies. He writes really catchy melodies that you can sing along to, even girls like Limelight and Tom Sawyer, But yeah, the vocal melody in this song is extremely melodic. The verse almost sounds like a Yes song again, very melodic and kind of like dreamy sounding, but the guitar solo section, that is a hammer. Like the rhythm section, Neil and Geddy are just like so tight together, and they're doing all these little fills and riffs together, super heavy, and Alex's tone is just sick, screeching over top. To me, it's like that. There's like sections of the song that are metal. There's sections of the song that are progressive, and then of course there's like the beautiful melodic fairy tale throughout the verses. So it really is all over the map, and it's not that long of a song to be able to do that
No,
either.
no, that's why I always thought of it as just being a really cool, good, good song. I'm also fascinated by singers who sing other people's lyrics and do
Yeah.
it extremely well because that's got to be. And Getty talked about it in his book a lot, obviously, because Neil wrote 99% of the lyrics, I think, and
Hmm.
just trying to make things right and make things that Neil would be happy about. And it was difficult because a lot of the songs, a lot of the lyrics, it's not very. There's a lot of stuff going on in those lyrics. It's not easy to make it super melodic. I think Bruce Dickinson does a great job too with some of the great Steve Harris songs where they're really
Hmm.
long and there's parts where you go, how did how do you figure out how to sing over this? And I think that's a big thing with Rush too. And I agree, Geddy Lee's a critically under appreciated vocalist because so many of these things they're doing, there's all this crazy stuff going on, especially we get into the Bite Toward the Snow Dog and a lot of the stuff on
Yeah.
Caress of Steel and even 2112. And how do you sing over this and make it melodic and make it go with the music too? That to me is like, I don't know how. I mean, look, I have zero musical parts in my brain on how to write or play or even sing anything, but I know when it works. And that's just always fascinating. Be like, well, how do you do that? I used to sit down a lot with John Arch, the great singer from Fate's Warning, from the first few records. And it was the same thing because they were doing this crazy progressive metal stuff. And he was doing all these unbelievable vocals, very influenced by Geddy Lee, of course. And I just sit down and ask him, like, okay, so what is this song about? And how do you figure out how to sing over it? It's really interesting to get people's perspectives on that.
I know, and this goes for a lot of bands too. Even if Geddy was just the singer in Rush, how he has to think about playing bass
Yeah.
and singing. And I saw an interview once where he said, one of them has to go on autopilot, and one of them I think about, and that switched over the years. He used to put the vocal on autopilot and focus on the bass, and then vice versa. But the way Maynard had to sing over Tool, the way David Lee Roth had to sing over Eddie Van Halen's guitar parts, like, what the hell are you going to do? It's already so good. So that is a huge challenge. So Getty's challenge to not only write great music, but then put a killer melody over top and fit these sometimes out there lyrics is just amazing to me, especially when you get to like the later records, like with Spirit of Radio and all that, because some of those words are so good, and he managed to put them over badass music. Like, it just blows my mind.
Yeah, and, Claudio from Coheed, one of my favorite bands, is also super progressive, and he's playing all these intricate, difficult guitar parts
Hmm.
and singing all these incredibly difficult melodies upon it. It's one thing to be able to do it in the studio, and again, Getty's book, which is really great, I highly recommend it. But he talks a little bit about that, where you go in and you make these songs in the studio, and then oh yeah, I have to like now play the bass part and sing it. And then later on, I have to play the bass part and the keyboard part and sing it. There's a lot going on there that you got to kind of figure out how to do that. And that's another aspect of, how does your brain, I mean, just even as a singer, I can't believe people remember all this stuff and all these different parts, but then you put in, oh yeah, I got to play a guitar or a bass that way too. Like that's a lot going on. That one side of your brain is definitely overworked when you're
For
performing it
sure.
live.
But this is what sets Rush in that legendary category that I will absolutely put them in with Zeppelin and Sabbath and Deep Purple and Maiden. They're in there 100%
Yeah.
because of that. Like, the ability of these musicians is just insane. And the fact that they can still do it, obviously they haven't because Neil passed away, but they're going to do it, next summer. And I'm sure it's going to be great. And it just goes to show, like, the level of talent and ability, especially in that era, the mid 70s. It's just mind blowing. And it does exist now, but you have to search for it so much harder because there's just so much music out there. And what, a million songs a week or something get put on Spotify, something insane like that. So how are we ever supposed to find the next
Right.
Rush?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's TikTok, but that's a whole nother story. Uh, so we do have to talk about the Canadian part of this because that's a big part, I think. That's the other interesting thing is here you have this progressive metal band that basically, as I mentioned before, invented a genre, coming from Toronto, Canada, which was not the hotbed of really any sort of musical thing at the time. And it was very difficult for Rush to get big outside of Canada too, because I think there's a bit of a in the US for a little while, Rush, Canadian band, whatever. It's like, not really a big thing. So coming from Canada is a big thing, obviously, but I don't know that people understand or can really estimate here in the US or really anywhere in the world how much Rush means to the country of Canada.
I think that changed drastically over the years because if you listen to Rush themselves, when they were shopping the first record around, they couldn't get arrested in Canada to the point where they had to make their own label to even put it out. And then the station in Cleveland starts playing it, and Cliff gets involved, and the next thing you know, they're signing a label deal in the US. Essentially, I believe their first deal was a US deal.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
like a lot of
Yeah, you mentioned Cliff real quick. That's Cliff Bernstein, who, of course, famous Cupid Management. They managed Metallica and 10 million other bands, but they were very integral in the early part of Rush, and that was kind of one of the first things that Cliff really kind of worked on. He was working at the label, but then really took on Rush, and yeah, he was the one that kind of stuck his neck out to sign them at Mercury at the
right.
time.
And now in full circle moment, Q Prime is now handling the Rush reunion.
Yeah, of course they are.
So, but as a teenager growing up, I didn't even see Rush as a Canadian band really, because they were by the mid '80s they were huge all over the world, and so the '70s portion of it and their struggle, to be recognized in Canada, I think is pretty well known. It was like, and this has happened to a lot of Canadian artists, Nickelback, Rush, Alanis Morissette. They go elsewhere, get a US deal or even a European deal, get really big, and then all of a sudden everybody at home goes, "Oh, wait, did we miss something here?" And I think that absolutely happened with Rush.
Sure.
And especially in the '90s when the tragedy happened with Neil's family and they took their hiatus and then came back, that's when I think a lot of people in Canada went, "Oh, you know what? We missed them." The documentary helped. I think a lot of people in Canada watched that because it was aired on TV there, and it made people realize, a lot like the Tragically Hip, who became Canada's sort of band, that this band is really respected around the world, and we should be paying a lot more attention. To the point now where in Canada, Rush is royalty, no question. But and of course, I would say through the '80s onwards, they were playing arenas everywhere in Canada. But I don't think it was appreciated until much later as like a household name, royalty, proudly Canadian. Doesn't necessarily always happen that quickly.
Yeah, and that's very common too, which I've noticed. Same thing for bands like Sweden, for example. Like, we have them on a Marth, and it took them forever. Like, they got big in Germany first, and then kind of everywhere else. And they're from Sweden, and in Sweden, it took a while for them to go, "Oh, okay, we like this band now." So I can see where that's at in Canada. And you're right. I mean, they got really kind of big everywhere else. And by the
It's
way,
funny you say sweet. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh no, go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, in Sweden, like that, there's not a lot of patting yourself on the back there. They don't like to brag. They don't like to, because when obviously I've worked with them on a Marth and we had a great record. And when I worked with Avatar, we had a #1 song in America. And I said, "Did the Swedish press pick it up?" They're like, "No, not at all. They don't care." It's like pop music. Unless you're pop music, the press is ignoring you. Metal's huge in Sweden, but it's not treated the same way as pop music in the press. So it's just sort of like this underlying, yeah, it's huge, but we're not going to talk about it.
Yeah, it kind of is always that way. I notice I don't know whether it's you just kind of take it for granted sometimes. Yeah, because like on Monomarth again, I think it was only 2 or 3 albums ago, and they've put out a lot of records. We finally got a #1 album in Sweden where they were #1 or #2 in all the rest of the world. So it's interesting how that mindset's there. But I did want to give a shout out. You mentioned the documentary, which is phenomenal, also made by Canadians, our friends at Banger
Yep.
Films. So that's a very Canadian entire endeavor there. And they make
One of the best documentaries ever, like of a
yeah.
band and music. It's just,
Look, everything they do, they did Flight 666, they did ZZ
yep.
Top, they've done so many of these great things. And yeah, that Rush documentary was incredible. And I think a lot of it, because Neil was a very private person, as we well know, the song that he wrote about that, Limelight, which
Hmm.
Geddy actually had to change the lyrics because it was all he was making it about himself, which is what it was, obviously. But Getty felt that we don't, so that's why he says we'll make one go crazy or whatever the lyrics are instead of makes me go crazy. So he changed that,
Yeah.
which I thought was a brilliant move because then it makes it about everything and not just about a personal thing. But Neil was never never really much in the press, never did very many interviews. Obviously, was a very private person and all that. But in that documentary, you really got to feel who he was, and he was such a big part of that. I was really blown away because before that, I just knew the guy's an amazing drummer, and he's very private, which is totally fine. But you see his personality and kind of what made him be who he is in that documentary. And I think that was a huge part of that because it's always been this big, he's been a big enigma over all these years. And people are like, man, this, one of the greatest drummers of all time. You don't really know much about him. And he's very private. And so that, I think that, and he was very, very into it and had a great, they got a lot of great stuff out of it in that documentary.
Yeah, I had the same feeling. I couldn't believe like how open he was. And I almost assumed when I heard that documentary was coming, he might be in it a bit, but it's probably going to be mostly Getty and Alex talking, but it's really all three of them fairly equally. And he just didn't like accolades. He didn't like being made a big deal about, and I don't think he liked when people came up to him in public too much
Oh,
either. And
no.
he just felt kind of embarrassed by it. And I when I first moved to LA in the early 2000s, I was walking my dog actually on a little quiet street here in the valley, and this guy whizzes past me on a bicycle up into the hills, like wearing the full outfit, the helmet and everything, like professional bicyclist. And about 20 minutes later, he comes flying back down, and I look, and he looks at me. I'm like, "Holy shit, that's Neil Peart." I could just tell. And
Yeah.
he was an avid bicyclist back
Oh,
then.
yeah.
And I look down, I'm wearing a Rush t-shirt.
Ah.
And he looks at me and I look at him and we just kind of nodded each other and he just kept riding. That's just like that's so funny.
Oh yeah, he was crazy about that. One of the Rush tours, Mr. Big opened for them, and I'm good
Yeah.
friends with Billy Sheehan, Mike Faley, who's worked at Metal Blade for years, manages Billy, and Billy was telling us because I was like, what's Neil like? Because nobody really knows. And he didn't really talk a lot about him, but he talked to him a bit. But they were playing at Irvine Meadows, and then the next gig they were playing was in San Diego, and that's I don't know, it's not an easy to get there other than a car. And even in a car, it's not easy because of the traffic. Neil rode his bike from there to San Diego. I don't even know how because there aren't that many roads you can really do that
Yeah.
on, but somehow he did it. And that's a long ride. I said, wait, he rode his bike from Irvine to San Diego in between shows. And he said, yeah, I guess he
That's
was
crazy.
doing that a lot on that tour. That's crazy. A bicycle, not a motorcycle.
Yeah, bicycle. Yeah. Right. They
Completely.
stopped that eventually as they got older and realized how dangerous it was.
Yeah, one false move and the tour's over. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
we know all about that with James Hetfield falling off the skateboard and
Yes.
that whole thing.
And
So
getting
yeah,
burned.
well, yeah, that wasn't anybody's fault necessarily. But real quick on that, it's kind of funny that still have all those flames up there. I don't know how he somehow he got over that phobia. If I got burned on stage, I don't know if I ever want to see another gigantic
Yeah, no
bout of
kidding.
flames on stage. Ew,
Some pretty
craziness.
bad PTSD there.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, so I think it's interesting too, the career that they had where you went from the early stuff and I have to be completely honest, I kind of checked out a little bit after moving pictures. And then when I read Getty's book, he started talking about, he got overly crazy with the keyboards in the 90s and early 2000s. And
Hmm.
then they
Hmm.
kind of, the last couple of Rush records, they went back to more the traditional stuff, which obviously, Alex was very happy about because you could actually hear the guitars. So I went
Hmm.
back and listened to those last couple of Rush records. And I was like, well, this is actually pretty good. This is kind of old school style Rush. And it was really like they were playing at a really high level still, which I was kind of blown away by.
Yeah, there's some good moments absolutely on the last 3 or 4 records. I think in the '90s counterparts, that's probably their last great record, like, as of if you look at their whole career. Not that they're then they took the hiatus after that, and then they came back and made, I think, 3 more records. And those records are good, but the 1994 record, I think, is Counterparts, is sort of there might be one more after that, Test for Echo, I think. also decent, but it's like that was the end of them constantly writing, recording, writing, recording, touring with no real break. And I think that does something to your creativity where you're constantly creating and moving. If you look at Iron Maiden, perfect example, from 81 to 91 was like the magic era, and then there was a lot of breaks with singer changes and stuff, and then even when Bruce came back, they made decent records, but they're not at the same level as you know
Well,
the magic era.
that's a whole other topic we can get into because I don't think that that's very much accurate because there's a lot of people that much prefer the later Bruce stuff than the early Bruce.
I
That's
know, but
another
they're all wrong.
that's all right. That's a podcast for another time. I do wanted to end by thanking you for basically forcing me to go to that final Rush show at the Forum.
That's
Uh,
right.
yeah, you invited me to go, and I was kind of like, I'd seen them a couple of times before that, and I was not overly impressed. It was honestly kind of boring, and I was like, I don't know if I really want to go. But the set list was great, and I saw the set list, and you're like, you gotta go, you gotta go. So I'm like, all right, fine, I went, and it was phenomenal. It was great, and it was of
It
course
was.
Neil's last ever show, which is even more important. And it was fun because we were surrounded. We had Australians sitting next to us, and it's just a really cool, like all these people from all over the world because they never really toured outside the U.S. very much. It's just pretty much in North America and never too much
Yeah.
outside of here. So all these people from Europe and Australia came knowing it was the last show. So thank you for not only inviting me, but basically forcing me to go to that show.
Well, I didn't know if it was for real going to be the very last show because even they weren't sure.
Yeah.
They talked about maybe doing residencies or whatever. Again, Neil's health issues had begun and nobody knew, at least outside of the circle. And I remember we were down on the floor, which I'd never done for a Rush show before. I'd always just sat in my seat like a little nerd and just watched the show and focused on Getty's fingers and watching every move just as a musician, really. But that show, I was just there as a music fan, and it was great to have you there. And then Marty O'Brien was with us as well, great bass player, and it was a great night. So I'm I bought tickets for the first show back at the Forum, so I guess we're going again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm excited for that too. They're playing one of my favorite new arenas in Fort Worth, Texas Dickies Arena. It's brand new. It's a little bit smaller. The sightlines are phenomenal. The sound is great. I saw Maiden there. I saw Ghost there. I've seen Post Malone there. And just a really great place. And they're playing 4 shows there. So I'm excited for that too. So, well, anyway, thank you so much for doing this. It was fun to get you a little bit longer time here and talk about some music than the
Yeah,
production thing. But appreciate you for all you've done for the podcast. And then we'll continue in the future.
my pleasure, Brian. I love doing it. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you, sir. All right, cool. And I guess now we'll do Scorpions.
Scorpions.
I have to finish my research here really